A 12-year-old girl with a rare blood disorder walked into St. Brendan's Children's Hospital in Halifax every Tuesday, not as a patient, but to leave wildflowers on the front desk for the nurses who had kept her mother comfortable in her final weeks. What she didn't know was that the man who owned that hospital had been searching for a bone marrow donor for his dying son for 2 years, and that she was the only match in all of Canada. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax was something Ivy had stopped noticing years ago. She was 12, small for her age, with dark braids that her grandmother Loretta redid every Sunday evening while they watched the Nature Channel together. She carried the wildflowers, usually goldenrod or clover, whatever grew along the creek path behind their apartment building in Dartmouth, wrapped in a damp paper towel so they wouldn't wilt before she got there. The nurses knew her by name. Jean at the front desk always said the same thing. "You're going to make somebody smile today, sweetheart." And Ivy always gave the same small nod because she didn't know what else to do with a compliment, and because the smiling had never really been the point. Her mother, Claire, had spent 11 months in that hospital. The nurses had brushed her hair when Ivy couldn't be there. That seemed like the kind of thing that deserved flowers forever. Loretta worried about the trips, not because of the ferry or the bus transfers. Ivy had been making that journey alone since she was 10, but because the hospital held grief that the girl carried home in her body like weather. Some Tuesdays she came back quiet and went straight to her room. Other Tuesdays she came back with a kind of fierce brightness that was almost harder to watch. "You don't have to keep going," Loretta had told her once gently over soup. "I know," Ivy said, and kept going. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in late October, when the goldenrod had died back and Ivy had settled for a handful of late-season clover, that she heard it. She was turning away from Jean's desk when a man's voice came sharp and low from down the corridor. Not angry, exactly, but the voice of someone holding themselves together by force of will. "There has to be something else you can do. 2 years, Dr. Reeves. 2 years, and every lead has gone nowhere." Ivy didn't mean to listen. She was putting on her backpack, but the voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that sound, the sound of an adult trying not to fall apart, was something she recognized from the inside out. She looked. Through the window of a consultation room, she could see a man in a dark coat, broad-shouldered, maybe 60, with the kind of face that probably looked commanding on a normal day. Right now, it looked like a wall with a crack running through it. Across from him sat a doctor in pale blue scrubs who was speaking carefully, the way people speak when every word has weight. Jean appeared at Ivy's elbow. "That's Mr. Aldous Crane," she murmured, not unkindly. "His boy is upstairs." "Has been for a while now." Ivy didn't ask anything else, but she thought about that voice the whole bus ride home. Aldous Crane was not a man accustomed to helplessness. He had built Crane Medical Properties from a single clinic in Moncton into the largest private hospital network in Atlantic Canada. He had navigated recessions and regulatory hearings and a divorce that had left him a single father at 43. He had always, eventually, found a way through. His son, Sebastian, was 11 years old and had been diagnosed with aplastic anemia 18 months ago. The disease had turned his bone marrow into something that could no longer do its job, no longer make the red cells and platelets a body needed to stay alive. The treatment was a bone marrow transplant. The obstacle was that Sebastian's tissue type was uncommon enough that no match had been found in any registry in North America or Europe. Aldous had funded a private search. He had contacted research centers in Germany and Japan. He had quietly offered donations to 3 different hospitals in exchange for priority testing access, which his lawyer had gently suggested was probably not how that worked, but which he had done anyway, because doing something, anything, felt better than sitting in that room watching his son's color fade. Sebastien was a reader. Even when he was tired, which was most of the time now, he had a book open beside him. He liked stories about explorers and naturalists, people who paid close attention to the world. He had recently become interested in migratory birds and had made Aldous download 3 different apps for tracking them, which Aldous did not know how to use but had pretended to find fascinating, because Sebastian lit up when he talked about them, and that light was the thing Aldous was most afraid of losing. "Dad," Sebastian said one afternoon, looking up from his book with the particular directness he had always had, even as a small child, "you're doing the face again." "What face?" "The one where you're trying to look normal." Aldous sat down in the chair beside the bed and said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the harbor was gray and flat under an overcast sky. "I'm working on it," he said finally. Sebastian considered this. "It's okay if you're scared. I'm scared too sometimes." Aldous felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He reached over and straightened the edge of his son's blanket, which didn't need straightening. "We're going to find a match," he said. "I know," Sebastian said, in the tone of someone who was choosing to believe something rather than being certain of it. He turned back to his book. It was 3 days after Ivy's Tuesday visit that the call came to Dr. Reeves' office. It was not from a registry or a research center or a German laboratory. It came from the hospital's own pediatric hematology unit, which had been quietly cross-referencing patient data as part of a routine compatibility study, a study Aldous had personally funded without expecting much from it. The results were flagged as anomalous because they were almost too clean. A 12-year-old outpatient with sickle cell trait, whose blood had been drawn as part of the study with her guardian's consent, had returned tissue typing results that matched Sebastian Crane's profile at a level the lab had to run 3 times before they believed it. Dr. Reeves sat with the results for an hour before calling anyone. She was a careful woman who had been in pediatric medicine for 22 years, and she knew that this news, which felt, on one hand, like a miracle, carried with it a weight of ethical complexity that she needed to think through clearly before any conversation happened. The donor was a child, an unrelated child, whose only connection to this hospital was a standing arrangement to leave flowers at the front desk. She called the hospital ethics board first. Then she called Aldous. Aldous, to his credit, did not immediately ask for the child's name or address. He sat very still on the other end of the phone and said, "Is she healthy? Is she safe to donate?" "We would need to do a full workup," Dr. Reeves said, "but her preliminary results are strong. She's young and her health markers are good, and she'd have to agree. Her family would have to agree. Voluntarily. Absolutely. This would go through the full consent process. There would be no pressure of any kind." There was a long pause. "I need you to understand something," Aldous said quietly. "I want my son to live more than I have ever wanted anything in my life, but I will not let this girl be harmed for his sake, not for any reason. If her family says no, we walk away." Dr. Reeves exhaled slowly. "I understand, Mr. Crane. Then let's do this properly." The conversation with Loretta did not go the way anyone expected. Dr. Reeves had arranged it carefully. A meeting at the family's convenience, a social worker present, printed information about the procedure and its risks, an emphasis on the entirely voluntary nature of everything being discussed. She had prepared for questions about recovery time and long-term effects. She had prepared for hesitation, for fear for a protective grandmother who might need time. What she had not prepared for was Loretta listening to everything in careful silence, and then turning to look at Ivy, who was sitting very straight in the chair beside her. "What do you think, baby?" Loretta asked. Ivy's brow was furrowed in the way it got when she was working something out. "The boy is sick the same way I'm sick? Like his bone marrow doesn't work. It's a different condition," Dr. Reeves said gently. "But yes, it affects the same system, and mine would help him. It's possible, yes. We'd need to do more tests to be certain." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom's marrow didn't work either at the end." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. "Nobody could help her. If somebody could have, I'd want them to." Loretta pressed her lips together. She put her hand over Ivy's on the table. "Let me understand the risks," Loretta said, turning back to Dr. Reeves. "All of them. Don't skip anything." The testing took 2 weeks. Ivy sat through blood draws and scans, and a consultation with a specialist from Toronto who had done hundreds of these procedures, and who talked to her direct level, which she appreciated. She asked him about recovery time and whether she'd be able to go back to school. She asked him whether it would work. He told her he couldn't promise that, but that the match was as good as he'd seen in 15 years. Aldous knew the testing was happening. He did not know the donor's name. He had specifically asked Dr. Reeves not to tell him until consent was finalized, because he didn't want to know something that might make him want to push, even unconsciously, in a direction he'd promised himself he wouldn't push. What he did not know was that Ivy had already met him. She had seen him again on one of her Tuesdays, coming out of the elevator while she was waiting for the bus. He had looked exhausted, and hadn't noticed her. She had recognized him from the consultation room window. She had thought about the sound his voice made when it cracked. She hadn't said anything. She didn't know what she would have said. When the testing was complete and Dr. Reeves sat down with Loretta and Ivy to go through the results, Ivy listened carefully to everything. Then she said, "I want to do it." Loretta looked at her for a long moment. "This is your choice, baby. I mean that. Not mine, not the doctor's. I know." Ivy met her grandmother's eyes. "I want to." It was the social worker, a steady, careful woman named Ms. Okafor, who first raised the question that everyone else had been quietly carrying. She asked it privately, with Loretta, after Ivy had stepped out to use the washroom. "She knows Mr. Crane owns this hospital. She figured it out," Loretta said. "She's sharp that way." It didn't change her answer. "And it doesn't change yours?" Loretta was quiet for a moment. "My daughter waited 11 months for help that never came. This boy has a chance. I'm not going to let what happened to Claire stop me from doing the right thing." She paused. "But I won't pretend it's simple." It wasn't simple. Nothing about it was simple. Aldous was told the donor's first name the morning the consent forms were signed. He was told she was 12, that she was healthy, that she had agreed freely and without any inducement. He was told her name was Ivy. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark of his apartment, 3 blocks from the hospital, because he'd stopped going home to the house in Bedford months ago, too far, too empty, and thought about a 12-year-old girl and what it meant that she was willing to do this. He thought about her the way you think about something you can't quite look at directly. In the morning, he went to see Sebastien and found him awake early, watching the harbor through his window. "Dad," Sebastien said without turning around. "Did something happen? They found a donor." Sebastien turned then. His face did something complicated, hope and fear arriving at the same time, each trying to make room for the other. "Who?" "A girl. She's 12. She's healthy." Aldous sat down. "She volunteered. Nobody asked her to. She said yes." Sebastien looked at the window for a moment. "Why would she do that? She doesn't know me." Aldous thought about everything he knew about Ivy, which was almost nothing, and about the wildflowers Jean had mentioned once, in passing, which he had not been able to stop thinking about since. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but some people are like that." Sebastien was quiet. Then, very quietly, "I want to thank her." "Maybe you will," Aldous said, "when you're better." The procedure was scheduled for a Friday. It was a peripheral blood stem cell collection, which meant Ivy would receive injections in the days before to stimulate her marrow, and then the cells would be collected through her bloodstream. Not a surgical harvest, the Toronto specialist had explained, which meant faster recovery and lower risk. It was still not nothing. It still required courage. Loretta brought Ivy to the hospital on the Tuesday before, which happened to be one of her regular flower days. Ivy asked if she could still leave the clover she'd brought. There was a patch behind the school that had somehow not died back yet, protected by a fence. Jean said, "Of course, sweetheart, of course you can." Aldous was in the corridor when they came in. He saw them before they saw him, a woman in her 60s with grey locks and a good coat, and a girl in a green jacket carrying a small bunch of clover wrapped in a wet paper towel. He didn't know how, something in the way the girl moved. Purposeful, unself-conscious. Or maybe just something in the particular Tuesday of it all. He should have walked past. He had promised himself he would not make this strange or pressure-filled or complicated. But the girl looked up and saw him, and something shifted in her expression. A flicker of recognition that told him, in the same instant, that she had known who he was for a while already. They looked at each other for a moment in the middle of the corridor of St. Brendan's Children's Hospital in Halifax. "You're the one who's doing this," Aldous said. It wasn't a question. His voice came out different than he intended, quieter. Ivy nodded. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself, and then he crouched down, because she was 12 and he was 6 feet and something, and he said, "I don't have words for what this means." Ivy seemed to consider this. "Your son likes birds," she said. "Jean told me." Aldous blinked. "He does. Yes. There was a red-tailed hawk on the ferry this morning, sitting on the railing for like 10 minutes. I've never seen that before." She paused. "You can tell him if you want, in case it cheers him up." Aldous found he could not speak for a moment. Behind him, somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped steadily. The lights were the same fluorescent lights they always were. "I will," he said. "Thank you, Ivy." She nodded, already turning back toward Jean's desk with her clover. The collection went smoothly. Ivy was tired afterward, more tired than she let on to Loretta, though Loretta knew anyway and didn't push, and spent 2 days on the couch watching nature documentaries, which felt appropriate. She was back at school by Wednesday. Sebastian's transplant happened on a gray November morning. Aldous sat beside his son until the pre-medication made him drowsy, and then he sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, which was the longest 6 hours of his life. His assistant had offered to come. His lawyer had offered to come. He had said no to both. He called Loretta. He had her number now, from the paperwork, not to ask anything, just to say the procedure had started, because it seemed right that she know. Loretta said she'd be thinking of him. She said it the way people say things they mean. The first signs that the transplant was working came 11 days later. Sebastian's numbers had been crawling up almost too slowly to be sure of, and then on a Wednesday afternoon they moved. Dr. Reeves came in with the results, and for once let her composure slip just slightly. A quick brightness in her eyes that she didn't try to hide. "It's early," she said. "We don't celebrate yet, but this is what we want to see." Sebastian, who had been pretending to read, looked up. "Is it the new cells?" "It looks like it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to write her a letter." He wrote it over 2 days, which was not because he was slow, but because he kept starting over. He wanted to get it right. In the end, it was 2 paragraphs, one about the hawk on the ferry, which his father had told him about and which he had thought about a lot, and one that just said, "I don't know how to thank you for something this big, so I'm going to try to be the kind of person who deserves it. I'm going to be paying attention to things. I think that might be what you do." Ivy read it 3 times at the kitchen table while Loretta made tea. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the box under her bed where she kept her mother's photographs. "Good kid?" Loretta asked. "Yeah," Ivy said. "I think so." It was Aldous who complicated things, as adults sometimes do when they are overwhelmed by gratitude and don't know what to do with it. He asked Dr. Reeves privately whether there was something he could do for Ivy's family. A fund for her education, perhaps. Help with the apartment. Something. Dr. Reeves said carefully that he was welcome to offer, but that the answer might be no, and that no would be a complete answer. He arranged a meeting with Loretta. Coffee. A cafe near the waterfront. Nothing formal. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been nervous in a very long time, which struck him as strange until he understood that he wasn't nervous about a negotiation or a board meeting. He was nervous about saying the wrong thing to someone who deserved only honesty. Loretta listened to his offer with the same careful quiet she brought to most things. Then she said, "My granddaughter made her own choice. I want you to understand that. I do. She didn't do it for money or for anything she'd get back. She did it because she's the person she is." Loretta wrapped her hands around her mug. Claire raised her well in the time she had. Aldous said nothing. He had learned these past months that some silences were better kept. "I'll tell you what I want," Loretta said. "I want Ivy to have a doctor she can see regularly, for follow-up. Not once and done. Ongoing. Her own condition needs monitoring and we've been patchwork with it. Done. I want her to be able to visit Sebastian, if they want to stay friends. Not because of obligation. If they want to, of course. Yes, of course." Loretta studied him for a moment over her coffee. "You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who thought money fixed things." Aldous looked out at the harbor. It was one of those flat, pewter Halifax November days that looked bleak and felt quietly beautiful if you paid attention. "I thought that for a long time," he said. "I'm working on it." Loretta seemed to find this acceptable. What neither of them had anticipated was the question that surfaced 2 weeks later when a journalist from a Halifax news magazine published a piece about pediatric bone marrow donation in Atlantic Canada and mentioned, without naming anyone, a recent case at St. Brendan's in which a child donor had been matched to the son of the hospital's owner. The piece was careful and accurate. It did not name Ivy or Sebastian. It did not editorialize. It was enough to prompt a call to Loretta from a woman named Sandra, who identified herself as Claire's younger sister and Ivy's aunt, who lived in Calgary and had had almost no contact with the family in 6 years. Loretta did not mention the call to Ivy immediately. She thought about it for 3 days first, which was the right number of days. When she did mention it, Ivy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Did she want something? She said she wanted to reconnect. That she'd seen something about a donor girl in Halifax and figured it might be you. She guessed it was me and she called because of that? Loretta met her granddaughter's eyes. That's what it sounded like to me too. Ivy picked at the edge of the table. Mom used to talk about her sometimes. She'd get this look. What kind of look? Like it was something that still hurt. Loretta nodded slowly. You don't have to do anything about this if you don't want to. Ivy thought for a while. Can I decide later? You can decide whenever you want, or never. Both are fine. Ivy nodded. She went back to her homework and Loretta went back to the dishes. And the apartment was quiet in the good way, the way it had learned to be, the two of them steady around each other like two people who had both survived something and come out the other side still standing. She didn't contact Sandra. Not then. But she thought about it. The way you think about a door that might be worth opening, when the time felt right. By December, Sebastien was strong enough for short walks in the atrium garden. He had a wool hat that he wore, pulled down over his ears, and a scarf his father had bought him that was technically too large, but which he refused to exchange because he liked the weight of it. He had also, improbably, made friends with one of the hospital maintenance workers, a man named Glenn, who brought birdseed in his coat pocket and had identified 7 species in the atrium garden since October. When Ivy came to visit, the first time on a Saturday, with Loretta and Aldous standing at a careful distance, Sebastien was waiting by the door with his hat on and a printed list of the 7 species. I have the hawk on here, he said by way of greeting. I put it first. Ivy looked at the list. You put it as red-tailed hawk, Ferry, November, Ivy's sighting, for accuracy. Right. She folded the list and put it in her jacket pocket. Do you want to walk around? Glenn said there were chickadees by the east window this morning. They walked around the garden for 45 minutes. Loretta and Aldous followed behind at a distance, not talking much, watching the 2 children move through the pale winter light, the girl in her green jacket, the boy with his too large scarf, stopping to look at a bird or a cloud formation through the glass ceiling, or nothing in particular, just existing in the same space with the ease of people who already understood something important about each other. She's extraordinary, Aldous said quietly. I know, Loretta said. Don't tell her too often. She'll get self-conscious. Aldous almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile he'd managed in months. In January, Sebastien was discharged. Aldous took the day off, something he had not done in years that wasn't a hospital vigil or a crisis, and they drove home to the house in Bedford together, the radio on low, the highway quiet in the way January highways are. Sebastien fell asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes out of the city, which was the first time he'd done that in a car in over a year. And Aldous drove the rest of the way holding that fact carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid to break. He thought about phone calls he needed to make and decisions pending at 2 hospitals in New Brunswick, and he thought about his son asleep in the seat beside him. And somewhere, in the middle of those 2 categories of thought, he made a quiet resolution that felt important enough to remember. He had spent 30 years building systems. He knew how they worked and where they failed. He knew that Sebastien's match had been found partly by luck and partly by a study that existed only because he'd had the resources to fund it. He knew how many families didn't have that. He knew how many children, like Ivy's mother, had waited on lists that moved too slowly, for donors that never came. He did not have a plan yet, but he knew the shape of what he needed to do. Spring came slowly to Halifax the way it always does, tentative, easily undone by one last week of cold in April, then settling in finally by the middle of May with the particular green that only happens along the Atlantic coast, salt-washed and sharp. Ivy turned 13 in April. Loretta made her a lemon cake and invited Sebastien and Aldous, which had seemed slightly formal when she first suggested it, and then turned out to be easy. Sebastien and Ivy spent most of the afternoon on the fire escape, with a pair of binoculars tracking something in the tree line, and Aldous and Loretta drank tea and talked about things that had nothing to do with hospitals or court orders or anything complicated, just the neighborhood and the spring, and whether the cafe on the corner had always been that good. The announcement about the Crane Foundation came in June. Aldous had spent 4 months in consultation with Dr. Reeves and 2 specialists in hematology and a policy researcher at Dalhousie, and the result was not the splashy charitable foundation launch that people expected from someone like him. It was a targeted operational thing, a registry expansion program, a donor incentive initiative, a funded research position focused specifically on rare tissue types. The kind of infrastructure that took years to build and didn't photograph well but mattered. When a reporter asked him about the inspiration, he said, "A girl I know taught me that sometimes one person in the right place can change everything. She didn't do it for recognition. I'm trying to build something that works even without a miracle." Ivy read the article at school during lunch and showed it to her friend Petra, who said it was cool, but whose eyes were already on her phone. Which was fine. Ivy folded the paper and put it in her bag. That Tuesday she brought Clover to Jean's desk as usual. "You're famous," Jean said, nodding toward the framed newspaper article that had appeared in the entrance display. A piece on St. Brendan's history that mentioned, in one paragraph, a young anonymous donor whose contribution had led to an expansion of the hospital's matching programs. "I'm not famous," Ivy said. "It doesn't say my name." "We know," Jean said, smiling. Ivy considered this. Then she said, "Okay, but don't make it weird." Jean laughed, and Ivy shouldered her bag and headed for the bus. And outside the May sky had gone that particular deep blue that shows up in the evening before the light changes, and the goldenrod along the creek path would be back soon. And her mother had loved this time of year, the way the city came back to itself after the winter. And Ivy thought about that as she walked, not with the old hollow ache, but with something warmer, something that had room in it for what was still here. She texted Sebastian on the ferry. "Chickadee sighting. One of the good ones." His reply came back fast, with a list of identifying features she hadn't asked for, which was exactly what she'd expected. She put her phone in her pocket and watched the harbor go past, gray-green and moving, and thought that this was the thing about paying attention. You could always find something worth seeing if you were willing to look.